I promise that I will never hurt you again. You know that isn't who I am. I love you so much. This is how domestic violence is portrayed in media. Immediately after an act of emotional or physical violence, the partner causing harm is apologetic and loving. It's the classic image of sending flowers after an incident of abuse. But is this true for all victims of abuse? Or is there a type of cycle to this behavior? This is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and today I'm speaking with
Diane Williams. I'm the president and CEO of JBWS.
Diane is going to break down something known as the cycle of violence, where there is a tension building phase, an explosion phase, and a loving and contrite phase. This occurs in abusive relationships to keep the person experiencing abuse in a constant cycle of hope, love, and fear. But before you listen to this episode, please take a moment to subscribe to Unsilenced wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to spread awareness about domestic violence to anyone in need. So, when we're talking about the cycle of violence, I'm not sure if the general public really understands what that means. So, can you kind of give an overview of what the cycle of violence even is?
For survivors or victims of domestic violence, they're probably more aware of what it feels like. And so I think it's helpful to kind of give a name to it because violence and the cycle of violence isn't random. It usually follows a pattern of behaviors. And so, just like anything, once you understand what that pattern looks like, it's more easy to identify and really either seek help or have an intervention when it's necessary for safety.
Mhm. And so there's three phases of the cycle of violence. And the first one of those phases is tension building. What exactly does that mean when we refer to that?
Sure. So the tension building phase is probably the one that people hear most about. That's when you hear the term walking on eggshells, which you will often hear. And that's really as things start to escalate. So the person who's using abuse might become more argumentative. They could be more critical during that period of time. There might be smaller conflicts or arguments. And then, that tension building phase, it really starts to escalate a little bit more. So the intensity starts to rise. And, a victim of domestic violence, when they're doing that walking on eggshells, actually kind of feels that, sees that, and experiences that because they kind of know what's coming next.
Mhm. Right. And I actually think it would be helpful too if we kind of gave some concrete examples, maybe. You mentioned some of them, but for instance, if a person's been causing harm, what are some of their behaviors or how might they show up in the tension building phase?
Absolutely. So many times victims of domestic violence are in a hyperarousal state. And it kind of goes back to the caveman days of when to keep yourself safe, you really needed to open up all of your senses to be aware of what's going on around you. Where's that dinosaur?
Mhm.
Right? And so that's kind of where fight, flight, or freeze kicks in so that you always feel like you're at the ready. And that is really anxiety provoking to stay in that phase for so long. But that's that sort of ability to tune into every single shift when that person is using abuse. It could be the look on their face, it could be them saying nothing, it could be, the way that they open the door, slam the door, the way they park the car, the way they're walking. Are they, walking heavier? Are they slamming doors? Is there an edge to their voice? That victims of domestic violence kind of tune into that and they start to feel and see, well, here it comes. It is starting to increase, and it might look slightly different for people who are using abuse, but it kind of follows that same sort of pattern where they become more agitated, more critical, where they'll start pointing out things that they say that person might be doing wrong. So it's very anxiety provoking, but at the same time, for a victim of domestic violence, that's when they're tuned in and they see all those little details like the person's, affect or their mannerisms, that their body language becomes, more threatening or dominating. And so they might talk more rapidly. There's kind of like an edge. And so that's when that victim of domestic violence kind of goes into a higher alert and that prepares kind of themselves. It's kind of that fight, flight, or freeze now gets activated because they know what the next phase is coming.
hmm I think this is actually a really good point because I'll never forget in my first 2 years of working at JBWS, somebody was talking about how I forget exactly the situation, but it was something like their partner was out at a party and they grabbed their shoulder. And to everybody else, that's like, oh, like, what's wrong with that? Like, no big deal. But to this person, it signified, oh my God, like something's going to happen when we get home. That's the signal. And I think people don't tend to think of domestic violence in that way or have these subtle signs. So, like, is it always that obvious in the tension stage, or is it mostly these like microaggressions, for lack of a better word?
So, for a victim of domestic violence, it becomes obvious. And most of the time, it's because this pattern happens over and over and over again. So, they almost become an expert on the situation and recognizing those signs, whether it is the way that someone grabs them, it could be a look. It could be even just a specific look, a stare. And that's almost like that sort of red flag,
Right.
like here it comes. And so you need to, there's some decision making here. And this is a really important aspect of it because the next phase is really where the intensity becomes explosive.
Right. Yeah, and it could be something like the tensing of a muscle or something. And I really like that you're tuning into that because it speaks to the hypervigilance too of being aware of another person and having to kind of monitor them almost. But you mentioned the second phase, which is explosion. And what does that mean?
That could mean anything from the intensity of the verbal arguments, because domestic violence is not just about physical abuse.
Mhm.
But this explosion stage is where the intensity now kind of pops. And these are the situations where often there is physical violence, sexual violence, there's threats, intimidation, restraint. Yeah, and these are the sorts of stages when police do get involved. This is typically the stage where the police are either called or that's where injury could potentially happen is during this explosive stage. This is where the violence has now escalated to the point of something is now happening that's an intense situation that the person using abuse is using on the other individual. And it's about control, it's about intimidation, and it has now hit that point where it often becomes physical.
Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation. And it's interesting because you touched on how there's all different forms of abuse, and that the explosion, how might that look if you're saying, because people tend to think of domestic violence as physical violence, as you said. So how might that explosion look for forms that aren't physical, that maybe people can start to recognize that that even is an explosion? Is there like a concrete kind of example?
Sure. I mean, that's where intimidation and threats, that could be someone right up in your face, pointing their finger in your face. It's intimidation. It is threats. It is saying, kind of like hitting those buttons or things that you would never say to someone else.
Right.
So verbally, it's like the filter is gone and there is unleashing of even verbal sorts of violence, that it is because the intent in the moment is to injure, while the tension building phase is escalating some of that. The explosion phase is here it is and it's coming at you. And so typically it doesn't go from a tension building phase to physical violence, you're going to start seeing some of those other things first. You're going to screaming that maybe somebody's punching the wall near you, that these some things. So you may not get physically hit or touched, but there's an explosive aspect of this that over a period of time, you will see starts to escalate in intensity. So maybe the first couple of times that this pattern of violence happens, that there may not be physical violence, but you have seen the intensity growing and growing over time. But that's kind of where it's going. So if physical violence hasn't happened yet, and you're seeing that this is intensifying, you need to understand that that's what's coming. And so that is one of the real key times for people to understand that we need to seek help. And when we stop talking about the phases, we can kind of talk about what then, if these cycles of violence are happening, what
Yeah.
then?
And, I can't help but think about this too, is in these phases, what is the effect of like an explosion on a person that's experiencing the violence? How does that maybe keep them in this relationship or keep them afraid or prevent them from leaving? Like, what is the impact on them when it escalates?
Sure. I mean, that's really a good point because the way that the cycle of violence gets maintained is there are three typical emotions that that victim of domestic violence is experiencing. It's love, hope, and fear,
Ooh.
right? And so because it's not always fear. And
Mhm.
if it was fear, it would be so much easier to not continue to remain in that sort of relationship with someone who's using abuse with you. But there's also love that's in there. There's also hope that's in there that it won't happen again, or, this was just a sort of one-off situation. And so those emotions that a victim of domestic violence feels, they're so conflictual and it's very confusing. And many times people, you'll see people not understand what's happening or make statements, often victim blaming statements. Like, I don't understand why he or she stays in that relationship. I wouldn't put up with that.
Mhm.
And it's really not that simple
Mhm.
uh, because the next phase that happens after the explosion phase is the honeymoon phase.
Which is the perfect time to then go into that because phase three, we have it as loving and contrite. So what does that mean? I think you're right. It plays such a pivotal role in this because I think Robin Hughes said this once, like nobody would say if it was all bad 24/7, but it never is. And I think
Right.
that that is an important piece of that. So can you kind of go into that a little bit more and what does that look like?
For someone who's using violence, the honeymoon phase is typically right after the explosive phase. And so they're almost immediately contrite, sorry. They could be blaming it on, I was just so stressed out. I had a really bad day at work, or, I drank too much. Um, it's never going to happen again. I love you. I love our family. I love our kids. Their behavior changes. Oftentimes, you're starting to see behaviors and words that were happening in the beginning of the relationship when you fell in love with them. And so it is so confusing, but it feels so good for a victim of domestic violence who just went through this tension building phase where they're walking on eggshells and then they experience the explosiveness
Mhm.
of the next phase. And now they're feeling this love bombing, this intense love, and it reminds them of why they fell in love with this person to begin with. And that's where the emotion of hope comes in, and so they start to have hope. Well, this person is sorry. The person who was using abuse is sorry. They said they were sorry. They said they weren't going to do it again. I know that they love me. And you know what? It's just because they love me so much that this is happening. And so it's that sort of mixture of the fear and the love and the hope kind of all coming together that are so absolutely confusing.
Mhm.
And it's really hard to leave when you feel like there's hope that it's not going to happen again.
Honestly, how do people leave then? Like, how do you get an intervention at that point? Or where is the most effective point to get an intervention? Or what would you say to people to recognize that it's still a problem, even if it's not a problem in that moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so incredibly important. And this podcast is really important because the first thing is recognizing the pattern.
Yeah.
Right. And so understanding what those stages are. So whether you're a victim of domestic violence or whether you're a friend of somebody who's experiencing this, you're experiencing this right along with them. You're a family member of someone who is experiencing domestic violence. You start to see those patterns as well. And so we have an entire concern document on our website that I would direct people to because it talks about how you intervene, because this is the best time to intervene is when you recognize that those patterns of behavior are there. So I like to say it's the three R's. The first is recognize. So recognize the pattern. The second is respond. Right. And so for a victim of domestic violence, that's responding to that situation that you are in. And the third R is the refer. So if you know someone who's experiencing these patterns of behavior, or if you are experiencing these patterns of violence, then you need to connect with somebody who is an expert in the field because the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when they're leaving a relationship. So you need to make sure that you have a safety plan in place and that you're working with somebody who's helped you develop that safety plan because that is the ultimate time when you are at your most risk. And so the three R's are to recognize the pattern of abuse, to refer, so whether it's getting help in that moment through someone like JBWS and calling the hotline and saying, I've seen this pattern of violence in my relationship, and I think I need to talk to someone. Even if you're not ready to leave, you've recognized that this is unhealthy. And these cycles of violence typically increase in severity. They also increase in how frequently they go through those cycles of violence. And so, and then the last one is to refer. So connect, make sure that you are talking with somebody who knows how to intervene safely when there is a pattern of violence that's happening and, seek help before it escalates to a place that's really harder to come back from where there's severe injury, any injury, or God forbid, death.
You know, it's interesting hearing you talk about this because I also wonder if people are listening and they can't clearly identify these three phases or these three cycles. Does that mean that abuse isn't occurring? Or could they, one, not be recognizing it because it's maybe more subtle now? Or two, it doesn't follow this exact pattern? Like, what would you say in response to that?
I would say reach out and have a conversation with someone. Call our helpline, come to our Family Justice Center, talk about what you have been. Because if you're questioning yourself, there is something that's happening. There is that little instinct inside of you that is saying something's not right here. And I need to get more information. I need to talk to someone because it doesn't feel like it should. And there are many times when people have gone through this cycle of violence so much that they start to disconnect from feeling, that they start to disconnect from observing because it's too much. When you're in that hyper arousal state of trying to stay safe, there's so much information, sensory information that's coming at you with what's happening that it's people will often shut down. And so if this is you, if this is someone you love, just make a phone call. just get more information. Maybe you're not, in a domestic violence relationship. Maybe you're in an unhealthy relationship and you would just like there to be some sort of an intervention because if you're questioning, you should be making the call.
Yeah, that's great advice. And the other thing that comes to mind too is in the loving and contrite phase. There's so much affection, love bombing to what you said, but does abuse actually stop during that phase, or is it always under the surface and it's still there rather than being as present and acute as it might have been in the explosion phase? Like, what does that look like? Like, does it ever actually truly go away, or is it just under the surface?
Well, without intervention, it typically just doesn't go away. The intervention is not just for victims of domestic violence. The intervention is really for the person who is using abuse in the relationship. And so if you are using this, if you are the person who's using abuse and you are seeing these patterns and you're recognizing this pattern yourself, you should be reaching out because it typically doesn't go away. It almost goes into hiding, because there's almost a panic around this person might leave me,
Hmm.
and so it becomes contrite. They could even feel sorry in the moment for what happened, but there is this sort of manipulative component to it that keeps that person engaged. And so, if we want to get at the core of stopping the cycle of violence, the intervention primarily and most successfully would be at the person who is using abuse. Because if just the victim of domestic violence is seeking help and not the person who's using abuse, domestic violence will never end. It will just find another victim. So, best possible scenario would be that both of the individuals that have been engaged in this cycle of violence would be seeking assistance so that the violence in the relationship could end.
Yeah. And I was talking to Mary Jane about this too, is that there's this belief almost societally that like people that are using abuse are these monster evil people. And so when there is that loving contrite aspect to it, people are like, "Oh, but see, like this is genuine. Like they feel bad about this, so it can't be abuse." And I think that that is a really important piece is like even if they do feel genuinely sorry and you're like, this is like genuine, like I feel like they're really sorry, is it still abusive?
There is this compulsive aspect to the behavior of someone who's using abuse. So they might want to stop using abuse, but they're not really quite sure how. It just becomes, almost this own disconnect for them. And like you said, they might be genuinely sorry afterwards. So it's so incredibly important because it is confusing. The love bombing is confusing, and the image of what somebody who uses abuse is is really not the reality because it is the soccer coach. It is the person who's the financial advisor. It's the attorney. It is the local priest. It just like what a survivor of domestic violence could look like you, me, anyone, cuts across all socioeconomic lines, ethnicities, religions, genders. It's the same thing for people who are using abuse. And for those that are using abuse, they often can present really, really well. They're often very charismatic and are very good. They're very persuasive. So, you know, it could it could be that your colleague at work and you just wouldn't even know it.
Yeah, great point. Before we wrap, is there anything else that you would like to touch upon regarding the cycle of violence or anything that you kind of want to expand upon?
So I think as someone who works with survivors of domestic violence, uh, recognizing that it is that victim of domestic violence that probably knows that pattern of behavior better than anyone else. They become the expert on their own situation. So it's really important to recognize that when you're intervening because they're going to know all those subtleties that we talked about. And recognizing those subtleties is what is going to help keep them safe.
Thank you, Diane, for helping our listeners understand what the cycle of violence is and how it can keep people in abusive relationships longer. I think the subtle clues that an explosion may be coming is particularly interesting because a look, a tensing of a muscle, or a heavier step may not seem like indicators of an explosion to the general public, but it's extremely clear to victims of abuse. Thank you for sharing this information. Please tune in next week to learn more about all facets of abuse because education is the first step in breaking the silence surrounding domestic violence. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency serving Morris County, New Jersey. Please let us know what topics you would like covered on this podcast by sending an email to podcast@jbws.org. Please note that this email address is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or access to services. If you live or work in Morris County and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, JBWS is here to help. Please visit our website at jbws.org to learn more about our services, or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to members of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you recognize controlling or abusive behaviors in yourself, JBWS can also help change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and adolescent males who have used abusive or controlling behaviors in their relationships. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn more. If you don't live in Morris County, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Domestic violence grows in silence, so thank you so much for listening and helping us break through that silence through these types of conversations. Please follow us on social media and continue to share our content to get as many people talking about domestic abuse as possible.